How every English king died. At the start of 2022, I made a video for fun, detailing how every English monarch died. At the time, I had a little over 2,000 subscribers, and I just started to use my editing software, so I had virtually no idea how to use it. The result was a poorly edited, haphazardly researched video exploring how every English and British monarch died, stretching from William the Conqueror to the Queen, Elizabeth II, who, at the time, had not yet died. Fast forward 6 months later, the Queen dies, and suddenly my video goes viral, accruing 2.5 million views, $16,000 in ad revenue, and a barrage of critical comments complaining about the terrible editing. Worth it? Perhaps. But I've always wanted to make a proper, well-edited and researched video since then, and that brings us on to today's video. Today's video will be the start of an updated series in which I break down how every English king died. Before I officially commence with this video, there are a few things we need to keep in mind. Firstly, there is a difference between English and British. English, for the sake of my own video, refers to anything beyond the Battle of Hastings in 1066 until the culmination of the Crown of England and Scotland into the single entity Britain, which occurred in 1707 under Queen Anne. Because of this video will convey the deaths of every king from William the Conqueror to the final official King of England. This video will also only detail the kings of England, so only the figures in history that held that title between 1066 and 1707. Don't expect Elizabeth II or Bloody Mary to make an appearance here because they will be in other videos. If you enjoyed today's video, make sure to leave a comment, like and subscribe. And without further ado, we can finally start today's video. This video will be a long one, the reason being simple. Between 1066 and 1707, there have been many kings of England, notably 26, who have been recognised as the King of England at any one point. We have to remember that before accurate autopsies, many monarchs died in reasonably mysterious ways. For example, one of the monarchs in Scotland died after apparently suffocating in a wall, whatever that means. With this consideration in mind, let's now address the first King of England. Number 1, William the Conqueror, 1066 to 1087. The dates which you see alongside the name refer to the years each king reigned for, and will be provided for each king as we go through this list. The first king, William the Conqueror, is perhaps one of the most famous kings to appear on the list. If you're someone like me who was raised in the UK, chances are that you were made to learn about the Battle of Hastings in school, and you'll already be familiar with this context. However, for those of you who do not already know, William the Conqueror invaded England in 1066, as he regarded himself as the true successor to the Kingdom of England upon the death of his childless godfather, Edward the Confessor. He defeated the usurper king, Harold Godwinson, in the Battle of Hastings in October 1066, and crowned himself the King of England in December of that year. His reign is characterised by a rather stringent policy of removing Anglo-Saxon culture and replacing it with his own Norman traditions. By the year 1087, William the Conqueror was only a former shell of himself, but he continued his aggression against the Kingdom of France. It was there, while sieging Mantes, that William either broke his leg or was taken ill. We're not too sure. He was taken to a nearby priory and sought sanctuary, but he ultimately never recovered from his injury and died at the age of 59. When William the Conqueror died, his succession laws differed to today's. Rather than his eldest son, Robert, inheriting England, he was given the Duchy of Normandy, which was the family's site of heritage. Instead, it was William's second son, also named William, who became the next King of England. Number 2, William II, 1087 to 1100. William II is a rather obscure King of England. William II never married, which has now attracted revisionist historians to consider his sexuality more deeply. In 1100, the unmarried king had attracted more enemies, and upon a hunting trip to the New Forest, his own man reportedly fired an arrow at him, piercing his lung and killing him. William II did not have any children, which meant his brother, Henry II, succeeded him as the new king. Henry, however, as the younger brother, did not have a right to the throne over his elder brother, Robert. Instead, Henry claimed that he was born in the purple, as he was born the year following his father, William the Conqueror, became King of England. Henry I, 1100 to 1135. Henry I's reign was one of the larger ones in English history, at 35 years. His reign is characterised by his fertility, or lack of in some cases. His original heir William died in the English Channel by drowning. Although he had a daughter Matilda, England had never had a queen before, so Henry made his barons swear to let her inherit once he died. Still, Henry tried desperately for a son with his new wife, Adeliza, but their efforts were in vain. In 1135, Henry was dying, weakened by a fresh bout of food poisoning, but undoubtedly already suffering from the ill effects of old age. With Henry gone, his supposed heir Matilda, who was expected to be the next monarch, was not in England at the time. She instead was with her husband, the Count of Anjou, in modern-day France. Her cousin, Stephen of Blois, was among many nobles of England to contest the succession. He claimed that a woman could not lead any men into battle. Stephen, ambitious, travelled from Boulogne to London, understanding that the city's population would support him as king, as he would then reward the city with certain privileges. They agreed, proclaiming Stephen as their next king. Number 4. Stephen of Blois, 1135 to 1154. We will eventually cover Matilda and her own interesting death in another video, but for now let's focus on Stephen's cause of death. For 15 years, a brutal civil war ravaged England, and in 1153, Stephen's son and heir died, completely destroying his confidence. Less than a year later, realising that the civil war would continue in vain, he agreed to let Matilda's eldest son, Henry, succeed him when he died. Matilda did not have long to wait. Stephen died in 1154 from stomach cancer, which sparked a quick journey from Henry, Matilda's son, to claim his new throne. Number 5. Henry II, 1154 to 1189. Henry II, like his mother and grandfather, was incredibly headstrong, often not realising that his actions had consequences. It was under Henry for the assassination of Thomas Becket at Canterbury Cathedral to occur, leading to fractions within his country and threats of invasion from France. His wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, intensified the risk of rebellion as she supported his sons over their father. The intense threat of civil war was almost too much for the ailing king. Henry died at the age of 56 in 1189 from a bleeding ulcer. Henry's successor is a renowned figure in English history. Number 6. Richard the Lionheart, 1189 to 1199. Despite his fame, Richard the Lionheart would rank as an ineffective king of England simply because, out of his 10-year reign, totalling 115 months, he spent only 6 of these within England. Instead, Richard was too busy with the Third Crusade, and upon being imprisoned by the Archduke of Austria, who demanded £100,000 worth of silver, this ultimately bankrupted England. To worsen the situation, England was once again at war with France, during which Richard was hit by a crossbow and died in his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine's, arms. Richard the Lionheart was also considered ineffective because he failed to produce an heir with his wife, Berengaria of Navarre. Because of this, the crown passed to his younger brother, John. Number 7. John, 1199 to 1216. King John, the only one of his name who has a reason for this, was too largely ineffective. He lost English territory to France, was excommunicated by the Pope, and was forced into signing the Magna Carta in 1215, after the barons once again rebelled against him. Weakened by this strain on his reputation, the rebels continued their attacks against him. Whilst John was sieging King's Lynn in Norfolk, he contracted dysentery and perished. When John died, his son and heir was only 9 years old, yet despite his young age, his reign would be a bit more successful. Number 8. Henry III, 1216 to 1272. A failed invasion of France, multiple Baron rebellions, and being forced to re-sign the Magna Carta. Between 1232 and 1258, his reign stabilised somewhat as he allied himself with the powerful Holy Roman Empire, yet this proved costly. In 1263, the barons once again rose in rebellion against their king, even kidnapping his son and heir, Edward. The successive threat of rebellion proved too much for the now infirm Henry. In 1272, hearing rumours of another rebellion, he reportedly suffered a panic attack, which he never recovered from. The new king, a former prisoner of the barons, vowed to not suffer the same fate as his father. Edward I, 1272 to 1307. Edward's first act as king was to prevent the spread of rebellion further. In the Welsh counties, a rebellion ensued, but this was ultimately put down as Edward invested in his military. When the Welsh counties wanted to rebel again, he responded by this time conquering the entirety of Wales and building English castles there. Fun fact, Middle and Northern Wales contains the highest concentration of English castles because of Edward's obsession with maintaining raw power. Edward believed that the best form of defence was offence. When Scotland lost its own raw line, Edward responded by invading Scotland, believing this show of military force would dissuade the English barons from any desire to rebel. However, this backfired when his ally, Robert the Bruce, wanted Scotland to have a Scottish king and crowned himself. The enraged Edward refused to give up, marching back to the Scottish border, but he, like his grandfather, contracted dysentery and died. The new king, who was hated by his father for being so weak, ultimately ended the Scottish campaign. He was to end the entirety of the war and return to London with his male lover. Number 10. Edward II, 1307 to 1327. After leaving Scotland, Edward, despite his homosexuality, married Isabella of France in a bid to ally himself with the former enemy. During the wedding, Isabella was not seated next to her husband as would be expected, but Edward had his male lover, Piers Gaveston, sat next to him instead. Over the next 14 years, the barons despised Edward's relationship to Gaveston, arguing that England was ruled by two kings, one in name, the other in bed. Once Gaveston was finally exiled, a fresh error occurred. Yet another male lover, known as Hugh Despenser, and his son, another Hugh. These Despensers had a reputation for hating women, and Queen Isabella was one of them. She, in return, despised them. By 1327, Isabella had her own lover, Roger Mortimer, who launched an invasion from France. Due to Edward's homosexuality, the church supported Isabella. She arranged for both Despensers to be hung, drawn, and quartered. Before 1327, no English king had ever abdicated, yet the barons wanted to press their advantage. They claimed that if Edward did not abdicate, they would kill him and his son outright. In tears, Edward decided to abdicate in favour of his son, Edward. By September of that year, the former king perished during imprisonment. However, no cause of death has ever been conclusive. He reportedly lived in a lap of luxury at Berkeley Castle, yet there were reports of abuse. One of these reports detailed a likely apocryphal story of Edward having a red-hot poker shoved up his backside, but this is likely only rumour. Other causes of death include depression, which is likely, considering he lost his crown and his lovers in the space of a few months. Edward III came to the throne at only 14 years old, having seen his father being forced to abdicate and his mother in her lover's arms. Yet his reign would spark one of England's longest and most successful. Edward III, 1327 to 1377. Edward's regent, Mortimer, his mother's lover, took advantage of his new position, and Edward hated this. Once Edward was married and had his own son and heir, he pressed hard for Mortimer's removal. Edward launched a surprise visit on Mortimer's castle, only to have his guards drag Mortimer to his place of execution. Edward's reign also saw the launching of the 100 Years' War, which proved extremely costly and virtually unsuccessful by the end of it. Another cause of damage to England was the Black Death, which killed a third of the English population, including many in Edward's own family. By the 1370s, the glory of his reign subsided due to internal disputes and financial worries, although rebellion was not really recorded in this period of reign. In 1377, the Good Parliament was established, however, which wanted to increase the power of commons. Edward was expected to oversee this, but well into his 60s, he was too sickly. Edward's son and heir died mere months before and Edward died from a stroke. We now move on to perhaps the most important part of English history. Remember, the War of the Roses is only around the corner, and this king will explain why. Because of agnatic primogeniture, the throne passed down to Edward's grandson, Richard, bypassing the surviving sons of Edward, John and Edward, who later represented the Lancaster and York factions in England. Instead of the uncles, Richard inherited the throne. Number 12. Richard II, 1377 to 1399. Coming to the throne when he was only 10 years old, Richard faced the Peasants' Revolt early on, which ended with the promise that he would restore rights to the common people. Unfortunately, this was mere lip service, and by 1397 his reign was branded, rightly so, as outright tyranny. His previous regent and uncle, John of Gaunt, died in the same year, and Richard wanted to safeguard his childless throne by disinheriting his son, Henry. Henry, however, responded with an invasion, which led to Richard's imprisonment and forced an abdication. This meant that then Richard died of starvation in prison. Number 13. Henry IV, 1399 to 1413. Henry IV was Richard II's cousin, and his short invasion of England allowed him to promote himself as king. Despite Henry's power, his usurpation of the throne allowed the succession rights in England to slowly move away from blood right alone into force, which would be detrimental to Henry's own grandson. By 1413, Henry was now ill, and his eldest son had been regent for 6 years. As he sickened, he remembered a prophecy which claimed that he would die in Jerusalem, maybe on a crusade. Unfortunately for Henry, this actually meant that he died in a room called the Jerusalem Chamber. Number 14. Henry V, 1413 to 1422. Henry IV's greatest achievement, however, was probably his own son. Henry V was seen as the great warrior king, and he continued the ongoing 100 Years' War. He captured key places in France, such as Orleans. By 1420, the English invasion of France reached boiling point in the Treaty of Troyes, where the French king was forced to recognise Henry as the next king of France. By the following year, Henry's son, also named Henry, was born, and everything looked like a golden age for England. But then Henry died in a French chateau. Because the death ended the succession of France in England's favour, many of his nobles believed that it was a French plot that killed him. In reality, Henry V died from dysentery. And now moving on to arguably one of the worst kings in English history. Number 15. Henry VI, 1422 to 1461/1471. Henry VI was a king in the crib, as his father died when he was only 1 year old. His childhood is arguably one which would be traumatic. His mother, Catherine of Valois, a princess of France, abandoned him to marry her new lover, Owen Tudor. This family would rise to prominence by the end of the War of the Roses, so keep that surname in mind. By the time Henry reached 18, he had no interest in being king. He loved academics, and he wanted to attend the universities of Oxford and Cambridge. His courtiers suggested that maybe his future wife, Margaret of Anjou, took a greater charge of royal responsibility, especially after she secured the succession by giving birth to a son and heir, Edward, 8 years after they married. However, everything was not rosy at this time either. You see, another part of the family, the Yorkist line, was suffering from the ill effects of rebellion. Edward of York witnessed the brutal execution of his father and started to judge Henry VI as a tyrannical king. This had already been done in 1399, remember, so Edward of York felt like he was legitimate in challenging his king. Edward of York, through military, was able to imprison Henry VI and become king. In 1470, the kingmaker, the Earl of Warwick, who had been instrumental in putting this Edward of York on the throne, backstabbed his new king and wanted Henry VI to become king once again. This was initially successful, but early into 1471, Edward of York once again stormed London and imprisoned Henry once more. This time there would be no challenge to his reign, as he ordered the assassination of Henry's son Edward and Henry VI himself. I'm not joking here. Apparently Henry VI was smothered to death with a pillow whilst being incarcerated at the Tower of London. Lovely. Number 16, Edward IV / Edward of York, 1461 to 1483. Edward IV was inspired by his great uncle, Henry IV, to challenge his king's tyranny and become king in his own right. His father had already tried and died in the process, so Edward, along with his brothers George and Richard, sparked a successful overthrow, and Edward IV became king in 1461. Edward relied on the most powerful magnate, the Earl of Warwick, to help him take the throne. When Warwick then requested that Edward marry Bonner of France, Edward did the opposite, and he married a lesser noblewoman, Elizabeth Woodville. Elizabeth Woodville would later go on to become Warwick's main rival. Their bitterness continued in 1470, where Warwick had enough and tried to remove Edward outright, establishing Henry VI. When Edward suppressed this rebellion in 1471, he was able to have 12 years of stable rule, before dying a sudden death at the age of 40. Because of his relatively young age, Edward's heir, Edward V, was only 12 years old. Number 17, Edward V. The reason why I have not been able to conclusively state when Edward died is because historians do not conclusively know. When he became king, his uncle, Richard the Lord Protector, had placed Edward in the Tower of London in the run-up to his coronation. Edward was never seen again, and Richard attended the coronation only to have himself crowned as king. It's highly likely that Richard III, or one of his allies or rivals in the Tudor faction, arranged the premature death of the young Edward V. Number 18, Richard III, 1483 to 1485. Edward's uncle, Richard III, crowned himself king, apparently after his wife, the power-hungry Anne Neville, advised that Richard do so, since Edward V was largely illegitimate, as his father was already married before he wed Elizabeth Woodville. Richard's reign was littered by threats of invasion from Henry Tudor, who was now the forerunner in the Lancaster faction of the royal family. By 1485, Henry Tudor invaded England, and on the promise that he wed Edward IV's eldest daughter, Elizabeth of York, he gained enough support to defeat Richard III in the Battle of Bosworth Field. The War of the Roses ended once Henry Tudor crowned himself the new King of England. Upon marrying Elizabeth of York, he united the Lancaster and York lines of the English royal family, under the single name, Tudor. Now, there are only 4 Tudor kings which take up spots 19, 20, 21 and 22. Henry VII, Henry VIII, Edward VI and Philip of Spain. Yes, you heard me correctly. Philip of Spain is a largely forgotten king of England, but when he married Bloody Mary in 1554, he was given the title as king rather than Prince of England. Now, I have already done a much more robust video covering the deaths of the Tudor monarchs and other members of the Tudor dynasty, and as such, I would rather you click on to watch this video than for me to water down my research and confine it here. So let's now skip ahead to the next dynasty which followed the Tudors, the Stuarts. Number 23, James I of England, 1603 to 1625. Unlike his son and grandson, Charles I and Charles II respectively, James I of England is more obscure to history fans. Nonetheless, his reign was incredibly interesting. Already the King of Scotland, James was a very superstitious king and tried to outlaw Catholics, even though his own wife, Elizabeth of Denmark, was one. Like Henry VIII, James was hedonistic, and by the end of his life, he suffered from alcohol poisoning and gout. When his doctor advised that he give up drinking and procured water for him, James contracted dysentery and died at the age of 53. Number 24. Charles I of England, 1625 to 1649. Charles I of England is incredibly interesting yet polarising, as under his reign he abolished Parliament and created the English Civil War, which led to his death. Charles I was obsessed with the idea of divine right, in which he, as king, was an intercessor with God, and that to go against God was to go against the king. For many in England, this was supported, but non-Anglicans, such as Catholics and Puritans, believed otherwise. In 1642, Charles then turned on parliamentarians after they demanded that he become a constitutional monarch. In doing so, he would have given up absolute authority and allowed the common people and lords to have greater political control. He refused, sparking the English Civil War. By 1648, Charles was found, imprisoned and tried, found guilty for treason against his own kingdom. Charles was executed, the first and so far only King of England to meet this fate. The result of Charles's death was the creation of the English Republic until the year 1660, under Oliver Cromwell. Despite the initial optimism, Cromwell created a police state aligned with puritanical ideals, outlawing drinking, many sports and games, and even swearing. When Cromwell died, his successor, his son, had very interest in taking power. Charles II, who was now exiled in the Netherlands, received a letter from Parliament asking him to become the next king, on the condition that he ruled constitutionally rather than absolutely. Charles agreed. Number 25. Charles II, 1660 to 1685. Charles II of England is something of an urban legend in England. Growing up, whilst watching Horrible Histories, there was an incredibly catchy tune in which it talked about the hedonism of Charles II, even though my personal favourite song happened to be about Cleopatra, but that's another story. Charles's reign was relatively uneventful, given his now constitutional status. He was more ceremonial than his predecessors, acting as a politically neutral, in inverted quotation marks, figure. His marriage to Catherine of Braganza certified his role in creating alliances for England, but because he could not have children with her, Charles's succession created anxiety for those in England. This is because England was a Protestant country, meaning that it did not agree with the Pope's authority over it. Charles was married to a Catholic and was likely an actual Catholic, but because he was never publicly a Catholic, the people in England didn't seem concerned. Charles's successor, who was his brother, however, was ambitious and fiercely Catholic. The anxiety with the succession coincided with Charles's death in 1685, likely from kidney failure. Number 26. James II, 1685 to 1688. When James succeeded his brother, James was already a public Catholic, but most of the country didn't seem to mind. However, only 2 years into James's reign, the king went on something of a spending spree in which he removed many Protestants from their high rank in office, replacing them with people who had no qualifications other than being Catholic. Only a year later, James then stipulated that all in England be forced to pay indulgences, which in essence was a tax paid to the Catholic Church, enraging many in England. Their rage grew further when James's much younger wife, Mary of Modena, gave birth to a healthy son and heir, meaning that Catholicism looked likely to stay. James, however, already had 2 daughters, Mary and Anne, who were fiercely Protestant. Mary was married to her cousin, yes, more inbreeding, who was the King of the Netherlands, and he was later asked to invade England and claim his wife as their new monarch. When William launched his invasion, James II of England seemed to give up too quickly. He even threw his Great Seal into the River Thames and tried to escape to France. When the public heard about this, they quickly sided with William, who at least wanted to be their king. When William of the Netherlands reached England, he immediately summoned Parliament, who discussed whether he should be allowed to be their king. This move was greatly admired by the public, as they felt that William actually respected their wishes. Parliament stated that since James had thrown his Great Seal into the Thames, this was equivalent to an abdication in favour of his Protestant daughter Mary. Mary, who was married to William of the Netherlands, was then recognised as the new monarch. But what about James II? James then died at 67 from a brain hemorrhage. Number 27, William III, 1688 to 1702. William III is actually the last de facto king of England, the reason being that his successor, Queen Anne, was a queen and not a king, and that she would also dissolve the Kingdom of England in 1707 to create the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. The last King of England died in 1702 when he fell from his horse, breaking his collarbone. He was expected to recover from this injury, but because he stayed in bed for weeks, he developed pneumonia. And there you have it, how every King of England died. Thank you guys so much for watching this video, as there are plenty more to come. As always, I'm the Shy Historian, and stay tuned for many more.